Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This is a companion to my Let's Play. This is going to spoil the whole game. Do not watch this anymore if you've not played the entire game. Even if you don't care about spoilers, it's not really going to make sense to you. A broad content warning for obviously discussion of murder and dead bodies, and some references to blood. There's no sections I'm highlighting in particular, just a warning that this comes up through the video. And continuing from the last spoiler episode, I'm going to put whodunit thoughts at the end, stuff about the how of the murders, just the kind of fun speculation on that mystery. All going to be put at the end. I'm going to do theme stuff first. The last time I recorded a spoiler episode, I was a little worried that I didn't have that much thematic stuff to talk about, and I was wondering if I was going to have to start doing 3 episodes at a time and making big gaps between spoiler episodes. Got a lot to talk about today. Parts 12 and 13 sure had a lot of stuff packed in there. So, let's get started. So, it's not the immediate aftermath of the murders, but this, part 12, is where a lot of people have had time to process what has happened, and they have now decided how they're going to respond. Eva and Natsuhi are the first I'm going to look at because they have a very funny, diverging approach. Eva is immediately on the offensive, because that is who she is. She's immediately wants to decide who is on my team, who is against me, who should I suspect? And of course she suspects Natsuhi, because she already just doesn't like Natsuhi. And there is circumstantial evidence that could lead one to believe that Natsuhi is the killer, especially, and I think this is key to a lot of the theorizing that will happen in the universe, it is easy to suspect Natsuhi if you are cynical and you don't empathize with her actual situation. Because a lot of the superficial elements of the mystery would make sense of, oh, the murder had to be carried out with someone who would have the similar knowledge to the servants, would have a good knowledge of the house as a whole. Who commands the servants? Natsuhi, of course, because Kraus is very uninvolved and does not take charge. Also, Kraus is dead, so he's obviously not the culprit. So, of course, in that sense, you could see it's Natsuhi. You could imagine reasons Natsuhi would want revenge. You could imagine ways in which Natsuhi is unhappy with the way everyone shits on her and has decided that she has had enough and that this is her retaliation. She's very passionate. She's very quick to just lash out. She's very quick to respond when people try to needle her, which Eva does a lot. And also, Eva just doesn't like Natsuhi. In a more fundamental way, Eva and Natsuhi have an extremely antagonistic relationship. So it is a very comfortable conclusion for Eva to come to, that Natsuhi, who's not really an Urashuramiya as far as Eva is concerned, that she must be the culprit. And what I find funny about this in particular is that Natsuhi has none of these thoughts. Natsuhi's thoughts are, well, obviously there's some 19th person. I will not interrogate this assumption. I am busy trying to make sure that everyone lives through today and, is able to get by, is not going to be murdered, and that we will just eat, be safe, and wait for the police to come in, who will naturally sort out everything and solve all the problems. And we know that's not going to happen, both because I'm not going to trust the police to sort out problems, but also they're literally never going to arrive. But Natsuhi's general approach is kind of the opposite of Eva's in that Natsuhi accepts everyone of the whole party as her in-group. Natsuhi is going to take care of the whole group because she is always the one running the house. That is her role. She takes care of the running of things and making sure everyone's okay. And even if she is shitty to the servants, she does not make the same kind of distinction where she has not gone through a suspicion of the servants are capable of having done all the murders. The servants are well positioned to be people who could do a lot of the things required for this murder to be pulled off. She's just not even thinking about that because to her, that's probably not her job in her head. But also, I think even with her distrust of the servants, I wouldn't be surprised if she wouldn't believe any of them are murderers. It's Kraus who actually switches shifts the night before so that the less trustworthy servants are not looking after them in the main mansion. It's not Natsuhi who makes that adjustment, which to me reads as more, even if Natsuhi doesn't like the association between Kinzo and the One-Winged Eagle servants, she probably has a little more faith in them than maybe even Kraus would. But I think even more fundamentally, she just doesn't read anyone around her as a killer and is not thinking through things in that way. And not in the way where Battler later will stubbornly refuse to think of the possibility of anyone he thinks of as being a friend or family. Battler is a very stubborn way, but the thought does not occur to Natsuhi. She is simply just on step one. There's a 19th person. They obviously did this. Let's make sure they don't get any of the rest of us. I bring these two up together in particular because Natsuhi's decisions inherently read as suspicious to Eva. Because Natsuhi goes to get a gun and says, everyone's gonna stay in this one room, no one leaves. And Eva's like, yep, you're the murderer. And in part, I think it's that Eva sees this as part of Natsuhi taking power. Because when Eva sees Natsuhi saying, I'll take care of things, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, let's manage this way. Natsuhi is trying to take care of things to make sure things run smoothly, because that is a responsibility she feels she has. Eva sees that as Natsuhi trying to take control of the situation. And even if Natsuhi wasn't the culprit, Eva wouldn't like that. Eva would feel that it's her position to take that power, and with it comes the responsibility. Whereas Natsuhi is really genuinely not as concerned with the figurehead status. She just wants to deal with a bunch of people. She just wants to take care of a group of traumatized people. And of course, she wants the prestige of the Ashura family. There's a reason she still cares about Jessica getting to be the heir and being a good heir. But it is distinctly different than the one-track mind Eva has, where even after many people have died, she is still thinking about how to leverage things for her own power. And it is worth acknowledging that no one Eva directly cares about has died. She has lost siblings in this, but Battler himself makes the judgment that only Eva and Hideyoshi have not been directly hurt by this. And the siblings have a strange relationship, so you could certainly make that read and not feel like it's too callous to say that Eva feels that way about her siblings. But it distinctly would affect her decision making. If George had been killed in these murders, Eva maybe would not be quite as quick to plan out how she can take control of the situation. And we will get to see that in future episodes. Episode 3 is going to be particularly interesting for seeing how Eva copes when things are going wrong. But anyway, that's enough about Eva and Natsuhi. I'll want to briefly touch on the blood found in the dining hall, because I think that's actually a very interesting scene. It's quite short, and it's not dwelt on in particular, but it's striking that this is a scene of blood from the murders, but it's very underwhelming, and it's because it's not staged. This is not a scene that was specifically laid out for people to discover it. Kumasawa just noticed there was blood in the room when she was getting it ready for breakfast. There was no indications trying to direct people's attention to come in here. There wasn't any kind of message being communicated with the blood. It's just that they did not manage to clean up the blood fully. Battler, in the narration, does say this is kind of anticlimactic actually. This isn't really that big a deal after the stuff we saw in the shed. And I think actually this serves to highlight the fact that the shed is like a tableau that is intentionally communicating things. And this will come up with the magic circle later too, but there is very specific intent in laying out the bodies in this way that is just not here in the dining room. And it's interesting that the dining room still has a massive effect on Jessica, because Unlike everyone else, she lives here. She has a ton of memories that are now tainted by the existence of this blood being here. And as she is getting increasingly distraught about this affecting her own conception of her home, Canon is the one to say, maybe you should go, miss, you should not be seeing this. And it's just interesting to have him be the one to try and pull her away, trying to direct her away from parts of the murder she really wasn't meant to see. And in other people's responses, Maria's response to the murders is, to be honest, not very strange to me. I feel like the actual issue with Maria here is that no one's truly communicating to her what's going on. Everyone else literally saw a very visceral scene of dead people. And they have tried to say that to Maria in quite frank ways, in ways that honestly I think is maybe not the best way to talk to a child, generally speaking. In particular, Maria does have a different communication style to what other children might. Again, she seems pretty coded as non-neurotypical, and just in general has demonstrated at times that she doesn't read people's faces, and has demonstrated at times that she just does not interact with people in the way they expect of her. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Maria's not clear on what has happened. They tell her that people have been murdered and that there are people dead. Does Maria understand the truth of what that is, or does Maria understand a kind of metaphorical conception of murder or death? Because if you think about it, children's TV has villains dying and we fight the bad guys. Children's TV will refer to this stuff a lot, and clearly she likes TV and watches a lot of TV. Some children might cry over this, having not clear boundaries of reality and fiction, and other children may then just understand death to not necessarily actually be the end of things, because a death can be many things. A death can be a death of an older type of yourself. Perhaps her mother dying could actually be the evil mother that Maria does not like going away, which, in all honesty, would just be a good thing. There's not a lot here, I will say, that leads me to specifically believe Maria has any particular interpretation of the events, but just that her muted reaction could very easily come from not registering exactly how severe the information being conveyed to her is. Everyone has the assumption that she must read the severity of their grief from their faces, but Maria herself is not very expressive. It has been noted that she doesn't make facial expressions that would be expected of her, and it feels reasonable to assume that that may correlate to her not reading other people's facial expressions. And in particular, Jessica is the one who expects Maria to read the grief on her face. And as with Rosa in other situations, Jessica's frustration with Maria here is that she just wants Maria to understand, but Jessica is not making the effort to make sure Maria does understand. And that is understandable because of the stage of grief that Jessica is in, but it is worth considering the fact that no one is really trying to talk to Maria and really make it clear to her. They seem uncomfortable enough giving her a very clumsy and short, your mother is dead. They seem uncomfortable enough just trying to convey the news to her in very clumsy and short sentences. And then, because she doesn't take interest, they sort of take that as a given that it's been dealt with and move on. And I think it is relevant to think about the fact that Maria has a narrative for what is happening here, which is Beatrice's resurrection spell. And that spell ends with everyone coming back. So there's no reason why Maria would necessarily be that worried if she thinks that in the end everyone's going to come back anyway, so it's really not a big deal. We just need Beatrice to arrive, because then everyone will be here and everyone will be happy, and we'll go to the Golden Land. The part where Eva and Natsuhi come back to declare that Kinzo has disappeared, and I do have to again say, it is admirable how committed Natsuhi is to her story. because she goes in and comes out and goes, he must have disappeared. When, oh, how could this have happened? When could this have happened? Obviously makes her look intensely suspicious as the last person to have seen him alive. And not just that, but she is also really committing to the bit by asking the servants, would he have left for any reason? It is highly unusual that he's left, isn't it? But even with all of this, she's insisting that he must be alive. You could imagine a way of trying to play this where you have them discover the dead body of Kinzo and go, oh no, he's dead, oh, and then hide the ruse you've been trying to pull off for over a year now. But she is adamant that he must be alive. She is still trying to keep that as a card she could hold on to. She's hoping that somehow, after everything that's happened, she could maintain the illusion that Kinzo is alive without them ever having to see him alive. There is no end goal for this, but this is there is no way she could pull that off. She refuses to stray from the established narrative. Then we do get to see a little bit of Battler's response, now that he's had processing time. And it's interesting that he himself sums it up as, it's not that I'm not upset, it's that I want to get revenge. I want to, fuck up the guy who did this. He's retaliatory and investigative, which is kind of a synthesis of his parents. This is what Rudolph and Kyrie would be like. Rudolph would want to deal with the person who had done this in the first place, while Kyrie would, as a detective, figure out what had happened, think it out, plot it out, and then say, yeah, okay, this is what we need to do. And so, with this, Battler is trying to parse things out. An interesting thing about this is that Battler doesn't really want to suspect anyone in his family, which is fair enough. But he's also very thorough. He wants to be accurate. He wants to know. He doesn't just want to find a potential culprit and settle on it. The thing that Eva did with Natsuhi is line up some things that looked like they could make sense, and that felt right to her, and that satisfied her understanding of the world and the situation. And then she said, yeah, so that's it. I think Natsuhi did it. And Ava's happy to stay there. But Battler won't stop digging, because this is where Battler gets stuck when he keeps spinning the chessboard around, because he's like, well, okay, here's an arrangement of events that makes sense, but here's a way I can upend that, make that no longer make sense, and then have every finger point this other way. But then again, that doesn't make sense for this other reason, so he has means he could use to suspect multiple different people. But like a true protagonist, he just wants to keep digging till he finds the actual truth. And this stubbornness is going to be a problem with Beatrice later, but for now it's kind of benefit because it means he doesn't just settle for Ava's narrative, and he also doesn't just settle for suspecting Ava herself either. He establishes a way in which one could see her as the culprit and be suspicious of her, but he doesn't want to challenge her with that, and that's not just because he's trying to play it close to the chest, it's because he's not really satisfied by that version of events, because it doesn't quite answer everything, and because it leaves gaps, he's not willing to just go with it. And in the process of him trying to figure this out, Ava is trying to bait him, basically, because she wants him on her side as a physically strong person. Ava's reasoning that he would be useful to have in her corner. What's funny in this section though is that it is clear that Battler is not as much of a dumb guy as he presents himself to be. He presents himself as just this stupid kid who doesn't know anything, and he's just a little goofy guy. But Ava knows that that's not true, which is why she presents some information to him and is pretty condescending about the idea that he wouldn't have already known some of the stuff he's hinting at. The narration almost makes it seem like he didn't know this stuff before, but I don't think it's true. I think it's more that it was not front of his mind. I think it's more the narration is following her line of thought so that the player can keep up. But the narration never really makes it seem as if Battler is completely surprised by Ava's conclusions. more that he'll follow her along, and then he'll immediately take further steps and like go deeper down that path than she was trying to lead him. And even when he's then trying to play it off as if he's like, oh no, I wasn't suspecting you, haha. Don't tell anyone about the lewd things I think. Eva's like, don't bullshit me, I know what you're thinking. There's no point in me trying to hide this. Which I do also love as an Eva reaction, because Eva is not a defensive person. She is too busy being on the offensive at all times to try to simultaneously pretend there's no way she could be suspicious, because she is spending all of her energy directing suspicion at other people. A thing that became clear in this conversation too of Battler and Eva that is just very clever to me is that the culprit is likely to be a servant in a way that makes suspecting a servant a foolish endeavor. This is a contradictory situation where these people are so well positioned to be the murderers, it would be idiotic of them to do the murder and do it in this manner. Which is why it makes sense that Beatrice is the culprit, because Beatrice is not a servant. Well, she was the family alchemist, but she's resigned now, so she's fine. She is not one of the servants one would expect to have done this murder. So she can make direct use of the servants to enact this murder, directly painting a target on the servants themselves in such a way that it's almost a double bluff, without anyone suspecting her, because at the end of the day, no one's going to suspect Beatrice unless they're willing to acknowledge the existence of Beatrice, which is in fact her goal, so she would then win. This is the perfect win-win situation for Beatrice. And the part that really made me think about this is the fact that Eva says, think of what a servant literally means, to serve as one's arms and legs. And she's trying to insinuate that Natsuhi is the killer, because Natsuhi basically got the servants to do her bidding. But in a much more literal sense, Cannon's body acts as Beatrice's arms and legs. More on that later in the How Done It section. It feels like Eva accidentally hit on a very key element of how this happened. So let's talk about magic time with Maria. I find it curious that everyone assumes the magic circle is a message to Kinzo. That is a fairly reasonable conclusion to have drawn, except that Kinzo is dead, and we know that Beatrice knows Kinzo is dead. So, who else might the magic circle be for? Well, maybe the other person who has an incredibly in-depth knowledge of this magic circle, Maria. And obviously she has an in-depth knowledge of it because she schools everybody on it in a brilliantly condescending lecture. And everyone knows this, but no one even remotely seems to believe that the message may have been for Maria. Or that it was for them, but that Maria was intended to be the recipient who would verify what the message means and communicate that to them. He doesn't give Maria nearly enough credit, considering just how in-depth and specific her knowledge of this circle is. Because again, you have to think about the fact that they were kind of attempting to draw something, and they were doing a poor job of it. And then Maria's like, oh, I think I know what you've got. And then manages to write Hebrew characters so precisely that the people looking are like, that's what it looked like. I recognize that. She must be doing a perfect job of enacting this circle, so she must know it intensely well, based on poor renditions of it, that she can then make into exact and accurate renditions of it. So the question, of course, is, what is Beatrice trying to do with this magic circle? I have a feeling she's in fact trying to give Maria a chance to show off her competence to them. It is simultaneously backing up the supernatural elements to this whole murder and giving some validity, spooking people, because of course the magic circle is creepy in and of itself, but having Maria detail what in fact it is, and that it is about human sacrifice, and that it's freeing someone from bonds, this is all background information and clues to exactly why someone would need to murder all these people in this way. So Maria seems like the perfect recipient for a message like this, to have conveyed all this information and give it to these people. Meanwhile, Battler's not seeing that and is instead only reading a kind of sinister angle to Maria being competent, confident, and then having a weird smile. And weird smile is a very subjective thing. A thing to think about when you're playing a visual novel like this is that the splash images are highly subjective things. The very creepy rendition of Maria's smile is Battler's view of Maria smiling in this situation. And now, if you're in a situation where your loved ones have been murdered and you see a child smiling, you'd be like, why are you smiling? Now is not the time. But again, as established, Maria has a different conception of what's going on than Battler does. And frankly, Maria is currently in a situation where adults are hanging on her every word, don't know shit about what she's telling them, and she has, down to a T, every piece of information here. She's living, she is thriving, knowing that for once, she's not being scolded and told that her magic shit is bullshit. She's not being told to behave like a normal girl. She's being allowed to be her best self and most powerful self. So of course she's loving it, especially because she gets to turn the tables on people. Maria is so often being talked down to and being insisted that she should know things, she should do things, she should be able to just do this and that. Meanwhile, here's her going, you can't even read this? It's from this psalm. Of course you should know this. Have you never read the Bible? I just think her smiling here is her being really confident and happy that she's in this situation, and I think that's a gift from Beatrice. I think Beatrice gave this to Maria knowing how good it would feel to have people actually believing in you in a way that they just otherwise will never do, because they do not value the things about you that you are. They do not value your strengths, and they're only concerned with your weaknesses. Because even her fellow kids who like Maria and still enjoy Maria do multiple times talk about how it's troublesome that she's a little bit off. And I think it's worth highlighting the fact that Jessica's not that worried about Maria's kind of flipped personality, because Jessica's seen this before. The fact that it is so creepy to Battler is because he hasn't seen Maria in so long that he had spent all day with her in this other more cutesy, like childish version of herself. For her to suddenly become so intensely like confident and in a way that reads to him as creepy, it feels like a different person. It feels like a huge shift, whereas Jessica's just like, yeah, Maria does that sometimes. It's just a shifting in mode. That's not unusual. We see people do that all the time. It's fun that the circle is connected to a talisman drawn in gold, and that it should allow you to break free from the bonds of any prison and receive the power to gain freedom. And it does explicitly say that bonds is not limited to some physical object. It could refer to the release from mental bonds, such as ties of obligation and inescapable fate. Could that be obligation and inescapable fate? Like a multi-generational abusive relationship? Maybe some sort of situation where you're almost a captive servant, serving for your grandfather and his family? Who could say? Could it be some sort of bonds where someone just will not let you go and insists on holding on to you and retaining ownership of you, no matter what you do, and in fact the ways in which you are no longer the person he is trying to cling onto? So in some sense, I feel like this magic circle is actually trying to reveal the emotional why of these murders. For Beatrice to self-actualize, she needs the Ashuramiya's gotten rid of, because they stand in her way, because they have imprisoned her, by and large, as a family unit. And if she tried to become herself and to escape, they would hinder her. They would stand in her way somewhat. And just their existence is an anchor that weighs on her. Some brief bits to just touch on. I enjoyed when the servants and Maria are really pushing Battler to try and accept magic. He, in his state, decides to lean on coping mechanisms he has gotten from both Rudolph and Kyrie, because when he is pushed into a corner like this, he thinks of the ways of thinking that have been imparted by his parents. He is using the lessons he has learned from his upbringing that ultimately are actually the opposite of how he needs to be engaging with these things. The best path to resolving the situation is to accept Beatrice. Of course, he doesn't know that, and instead he leans on the advice of his parents, who would tell him to be a very rational and logical person, to both refuse at all costs to accept the notion of magic being real, or demons, or witches, and then at the same time to logic lord yourself out of situations like this. Also, because there is a brief conversation about Natsuhi not being chosen as a sacrifice and how it's unfortunate. If she had been chosen, then maybe Shannon could still be alive. An additional thought I had about this, especially thinking of later stuff that's going to come down the line, is that Beatrice has to obey her own rules of magic, even if they seem silly. Even if it's a little plastic scorpion charm thing that's very cheap and that is hard to accept as having real magical power, Beatrice has to maintain the narrative, because if she starts to make her magic do whatever she wants, then that breaks the thread. There is no way to be able to deal with a witch if she can just make things up whenever she feels like it. She needs to be consistent for you to really be able to trust in her magic and not think it's all just kind of whatever she wants it to be in any given moment. And this is really just like an author who's obeying the rules of fiction, because someone can write a sci-fi novel or a fantasy novel, and people can still feel grounded by understanding a degree of common area of what the rules of play are, what the rules of the world are. You can break from reality as long as you're not expecting the reader to agree with any leaps whatsoever you make at any point, but instead offering the reader a degree of trust in you. Themes about authorship and readers are going to become more prevalent, but this was a funny one that I just picked up in this particular moment. Next, I want to talk about the conversation in the kitchen with the servants, where Battler proves that he is not an ally and you cannot come out to him. At the beginning, there's a feeling out in this conversation where they're trying to determine whether or not they can trust Battler, whether or not they can talk to him. And it's the kind of thing where when it is a difficult conversation and they don't know if they're realistically safe with Battler. And when I say safe here, I don't mean in the sense that Battler might not physically retaliate, but there's a vulnerability involved in trying to have this conversation, and if Battler is at all bad about receiving this information and the sensitivity required to handle it, then it's not worth having the conversation with him. We know that Battler has been insensitive in the past. I've talked a lot about that on previous parts, so there's not a lot of reason to think he could be trusted with this information. I think it's worth calling back here to the first time Canon sees Battler, where Battler is thoughtful and helpful, and gives Canon a hand in a situation that is difficult. But then, not long after, we do see the insensitivities of Battler again. I've talked about those a bunch, but just ways in which he will socially interact with other people, and the ways he'll be oblivious to the harm he does. I don't blame Canon for not wanting to talk about Beatrice openly. Which is why they use metaphors. They use magical references to how Beatrice works. They refer to the idea that Beatrice doesn't have a literal body on the island. And Battler just isn't having it. And it's not just about the fact that Battler doesn't believe something that I think a lot of people would struggle with when told in this way. Battler's demeanor about the situation too. They're clearly talking with a degree of seriousness, and his response is to laugh, and then he feels uncomfortable when he realizes no one else is laughing. But he doesn't apologize at that point or interrogate it further. He continues talking as if the only reason they could conceivably believe any of this is if Kinzo is paying them. and continues to make a mockery of what they're all saying. I think worth kind of, again, very specifically pointing out is that if you watch this conversation through, when Battler comes in, they're caught off guard for one, because he was eavesdropping, and I don't think it was by accident. I think he was hoping to hear something that could be useful information. Again, not because I think he specifically suspects the servants or has any particular agenda against them, so much as he is just information gathering, because he wants to know the truth. So he starts on the wrong foot. He starts from a shitty place, and then steps in, and then presses them on a topic that they were intending to discuss privately, that he intruded on. And even then, I get the sense that initially in the conversation, they're testing the waters to see, can we have this conversation? You can read it very easily that Canon is kind of leading the possibility of being honest about some things to Battler. And Genji and Kumasawa are there to help, to kind of carry some of the weight of the conversation and to try and smoothen out certain things as needed. And when Battler starts to give responses that make it seem doubtful that they can have this conversation, Canon clams up a bit, and then Genji and Kumasawa step in. As I said, then this is when they will speak in things that are true but are metaphors, and they talk a little bit around what's going on because they don't want to give the more direct version of events. And I think a key thing to why Battler is unable to have this conversation properly is because Battler is looking to solve a crime and not to be an empathetic person in a complicated situation. It is understandable why having several of your family murdered would lead someone to not be empathetic. It's also just not Battler's response. Battler is using the chessboard thinking. He is trying to logic out a situation. And so he is inherently not in the position of trying to think from another person's point of view. Because a thing that occurs to me is that the chessboard thinking is literally about not changing your point of view. Because if you think about the physical reality of this metaphor, you are sitting across the table from somebody else who has different thoughts, feelings, ideas, background, history, everything. And instead of thinking about what they're looking at, what they're thinking, and what they're planning, if you spin the chessboard around, you don't need to change anything about your processes. You are just going to now look at what information they have. And this lack of empathy is a lot of why Battler will have trouble with the chessboard thinking, because, as he'll come to recognize later, the witches don't play by the same rules. And that's because they just don't have the same situation on their side. Life is not an even game where everyone is in the same situation as each other, and likewise, everyone is not the same as each other. People do not all make the same decisions. And the chessboard thinking breaks down there because you need to actually understand the other person to know why they're making the decisions they are. But Battler is not here to understand people, he's here to be pissed off at the person who killed people he loves. And to give a very specific example, when they talk about the different kind of magical metaphors around Beatrice and around people and communication and understanding, Maria talks about the idea of wavelengths, that you need to be on the correct wavelength to be able to see and talk to Beatrice. Now, that is a very apt metaphor for what is already a metaphor in English of just being on the right wavelength with someone, being able to kind of communicate and interact, being on the same page, being able to have the same default assumptions about things, and being able to communicate on a certain level where you both have a shared information and shared knowledge or experience. And Battler doesn't have that. But not only does he not have that, Battler rejects the notion of wavelengths here. And again, Murray is presenting it as a magical explanation, but if Battler was to think about it, he could understand a subjective but emotional reasoning behind this that would make perfect sense. Because as I've said before, the magic is a metaphor that is supposed to communicate an intangible reality. There's not a specific objective description that could be used to explain the wavelengths, so instead you use something that is descriptive of real things, but real things that are not easily described. similar to using a chess game as a metaphor for a puzzle or a battle of wits. And then Battler really, really tops off the "you cannot trust him with his conversation" section by owning a 9-year-old with facts and logic. He becomes extremely Erica-like. We'll get to that goblin later, but he is only caring about going, "Aha! Maria, that present you gave me that was a big deal to you and that I took from you because I was trying to give you some confidence after making fun of you inadvertently. Yeah, it turns out I lost that because I was extremely careless with it and didn't really care about it longer term." Instead of being apologetic or at all acknowledging how kind of shitty that is of him, he's just like, "Aha, this proves it's bullshit then." Because think about the sequence of events of, if these murders never happened, none of this happens. And the morning comes, everyone's just fine, they're getting breakfast, and then Maria maybe asks about the charm. Battler's lost it. Because he just does not care about something that Maria values. And because he just thinks, well, since I think it's nonsense, I don't care about it, I will not invest in it. To the point that in this moment, partly because he's creeped out by Maria, because he's confused by her change of demeanor, he's willing to just, debate a child about this. When, there's no honest situation where Battler thinks Maria is a culprit. At worst, an accomplice, inadvertently. He's not really debating with her because he thinks there's some truth or value to get out of it. He's just kind of being shitty to a child because he's insecure in this situation, and his way of being secure is to push his logical reasoning and deduction. Because once it's stuff that he values and can believe in, he'll be more comfortable being able to assert that sort of stuff. And as part of this comfort, it is simply not enough that he doesn't believe in the same things as the servants and Maria. He has to assert that they can't sincerely believe it either. Maria might believe it because she's a child, but the servants must just be being paid by Kinzo because no adult would truly believe in these things. Because he can't reconcile that with his understanding of what being an adult is. This is a separate recording being cut in because I was reminded after recording this that Battler is lying. He didn't lose the scorpion charm. Which is just an incredible feat of someone attempting to use objective facts and logic to try and prove what is obviously the real truth, and it's not some bullshit witch thing, but he's just lying. It is not at all based on actual truth or reality or facts. It's based on his assertion that magic can't be true. So he just makes up something that's just categorically untrue. It's a real underscoring of the hypocrisy. I look forward to seeing the exact wording on his admission of this later, because I didn't look it up since I'll be playing it soon. But it's just an incredible move from someone who's ostensibly all about the actual truth, and I do think there's an extent to which he's determinedly looking to find the real truth, but he has such a set of assumptions baked in about what counts as real truth and what doesn't. He's so convinced that the bracelet means nothing that he will lie about this because it's just obviously not the bracelet. So there's no reason to be as stubbornly sticking to the truth in this case as in other cases. Battler sucks here. It's so bad. He just couldn't let himself be owned by a child, and so he owned himself even harder. Then there's a really interesting conversation about the idea of age and experience and people's different selves that they have within them. The thing I find interesting about this is that everyone understands this as a general principle, the idea that a person is not the one person in all situations, that there can be a childish Maria, and that there can be a cute, childish, insecure Maria, and there can be a confident, assertive, magical Maria, and that these are two Marias, but that there is also one Maria. and no one has problems with this. But the concept of Beatrice is more complicated, and she is being introduced in a coy way because of an insecurity around whether or not they would accept her. But the fact that that insecurity is there is somewhat of an indication that if Beatrice realistically tried to talk to people there, they would probably dismiss this, because in this talking about different selves, there's an extent to which they're asserting that it's a childish exploration. It's interesting that they do understand the ways in which people have this differing individuality that is contextual. People have a personhood that is different in different situations. And when they talk about children, they understand the ways in which children intentionally cultivate this personality. It's not that you accidentally are a different way with your friends than you are with your parents. That will still happen, but there's also an intentional attempt to cultivate an identity. And that isn't seen as fake, that's seen as a natural evolution of how people behave, because people are looking to see who they should be and how they should be. And yet, they cannot accept Beatrice, or at the very least, cannot be accepted to easily accept Beatrice, even if perhaps they could come around. We do see what it looks like for Battler to come around after all, but that takes a long time to come. And this idea of experience being a measure of maturity, experience being what defines a child and an adult, which kind of ties back to an earlier conversation I had that George is considered one of the children, even though he is 5 years older than Battler. He is 23, but he is still grouped with them because in a sense he's not that experienced, he hasn't formed his own business and so forth. So he is lacking the experiences required that he could be considered an adult. But then, that's a very complicated definition, because what experience counts? What experience do you need to be an adult? What about adults who are foolish and who don't know about things of the world, but have lived many years? What about the children who are wise, who maybe have had to take care of themselves because they have an absentee mother who leaves them at home by themselves quite regularly? What about children who have been traumatized? Does this trauma teach them things about the world that an adult with a very sheltered upbringing would lack? And to be more specific, what about Maria is less mature when she is unquestionably accepting of Beatrice in a way that the rest of the adults are absolutely not? The game does allude to us with a line, of course, age isn't something to respect if a person's just wasted their lives. I think even that is barely scratching at the surface of the fact that realistically maturity is often a measure of how well you've assimilated to society more than a measure of any actual capabilities. The gendered expectations of the world are such that lots of people who might run a business and don't know shit about how to cook and clean are absolutely considered adults. And then one particular thing about children forming their identities with intentionality, they do say that it is a thing to be encouraged, and that if you make fun of it, you could cause the child to regress in a way that is negative and is unsupportive. This is a very interesting thing to raise when A. Battler has just failed in a situation like this with Canon. He has failed to provide a situation where Canon could be more explicit and open about certain aspects, and they, in the text of the game, acknowledge that Rosa does not do this for Maria. Rosa is causing Maria to regress, and meaning that, in some ways, I think it would not be unreasonable to say that Maria has formed coping mechanisms to deal with how her mother treats her that deeply influence the kind of personalities she projects. So that was a lot of thematic thoughts, and I only have a little bit about the how the murders were done kind of discussion, and I am a fool. So reading through comments from the last one, there was some hinting of stuff, and also with the conversations about multiple culprits being invoked and the difficulty in a singular person being able to do these murders, it is also worth remembering that Canon was struggling to move some fertilizer in a wheelbarrow, so that body, moving 6 dead bodies, would probably have been difficult. So there are presumably multiple culprits, the obvious accomplice would be Genji, or even theoretically Genji's body. Again, Beatrice could potentially be two people. There's nothing in the rulebook that says Beatrice couldn't take over Genji as well, though more accurately I would probably say that would be Ronove. I haven't had to say his name yet in the playthrough. That's probably how I'll say it, even if it does feel pretty wrong. The evidence for this would, aside from Genji would be supportive, I do think Genji would be willing to help in this endeavor as someone with a lot of guilt perhaps, and maybe debt to pay to Beatrice. Not to mention having the capabilities, because he's generally seen to be more capable than he necessarily gives off. He snags a fly out of the air at one point, which is an odd scene, but seems like it's supposed to indicate some prowess there that you might not necessarily intuit. And also early on, the second day begins with Genji and Kanon getting dressed, getting ready in the morning. They seem tired as they get up early. And in retrospect, that would certainly be how one would feel after spending all night not only performing murders, but then staging the bodies. And of course, Genji has a direct control over lots of running of the house, like perhaps the malfunctioning radio that means they cannot contact the police, as well as the boat that would normally be on the island but has just been sent for repairs, quite unfortunately. And the other thing that came to me was the question of where the sixth body comes from could also be Beatrice. It had not occurred to me before, but there is at least one, if not in fact two, Beatrice bodies theoretically unaccounted for. When I say theoretically unaccounted for, what I actually mean is I don't remember if this ever gets directly addressed, but we know that there are two generations of Beatrice that have died, one of which for sure on this island, the other presumably also on the island, and at the very least one generation of Beatrice was entirely hidden away and only existed on this island, so where else would she be buried except for perhaps the huge church that Kinzo had built, does not use, but insists on being cleaned regularly. It's suggested at one point that it might have been built for the sake of marrying Beatrice if he could ever find his old love again. It could just as easily be a way for him to entomb his love that he has lost again. In either case, Genji would know where that body is. Genji would have the access required to take that body, and none of the rest of the family would have even been aware that it was there. And then, finally, just from the conversation in the kitchen, I just have some kind of lingering questions that I'll ruminate on that may come up a little bit more. I'm still unclear on how the roulette chooses Shannon, and I don't know if it's straight up just a roulette, or if the roulette just refers to circumstances. Like I was saying earlier, Beatrice has a degree of responsibility to stick with her rules of magic in order to maintain the narrative. Or is there actually some specific game or selection method that is choosing the victims? Because they speak of it as bad luck. And the other part here that I find curious is that Kumasawa is talking to them while she's doing the dishes. She's facing away from them. She makes a reference to the fact that they must be very tired as she talks about Beatrice and how Shannon died and how it's unfortunate. Does she have a suspicion about the murder? Is she trying to do a kind of sideways confrontation here? Where she doesn't want to directly call them out or ask, but she does want to determine whether or not it may have been the case. Is it possible Kumasawa was involved? Nothing has really given me that indication so far. But it is something I will ponder as we continue. As of now, I mostly think the bodies involved were the ones belonging to Kanon and Genji. It remains to be seen if that will bear out for the rest of this episode. But that's all for this one. This has been a long one, so this has been a good fun section and a lot to chew on. Looking forward to further developments as the cast gets whittled down further and further. Thank you for watching this episode. If you have thoughts or comments, whatever, do comment below. I read all the comments. They're a lot of fun. They evoke a lot of thoughts. A lot of people have thought about this game much more than I have. But that's all for this time. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.